Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our virtual Time to Remember. I am the host of your program this afternoon. My name is Emily Lohr, and I'm the program coordinator here at the Bruce County Museum and Cultural Center. And Bill Streeter joins us to deliver a presentation on the Bruce County Boys and the Battle of Givenchy during the First World War on June 15th and 16th, 1915. Bill Streeter is a lifelong Bruce County resident, and in 2019 was honored by receiving the 2019 Municipal Heritage Conservation Award from the town of Saugeen Shores. Bill completed extensive research on a variety of projects for the Heritage Committee and personal interest, including work for the Commemorative Banner Project, interpretive plaques, heritage outreach, and numerous military history presentations. We are lucky to have someone as passionate as Bill in our community to uncover and preserve this local history. Without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Bill.
Great. Thanks, Emily. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here today as we approach Remembrance Day. This is my first time speaking from the museum, and I'm looking forward to sharing my major research project of the year with you. And this year it's a story of a quite short battle, lasted about 24 hours, but it had a very significant impact on our community and on Bruce County families. While it was insignificant overall in the war, it was very significant for our communities. It was on August 4th, 1914, that Britain declared war on Germany, which meant that all countries of the British Commonwealth were also at war. At the time, Canada only had an army of 3,000 men, and they were stationed at one base in Valcartier, Quebec, near Quebec City. The call went out to the local militia groups, battalions, all across Canada to recruit volunteers for a Canadian Expeditionary Force to total 25,000. In a few short weeks, more than 33,000 volunteers arrived at Valcartier. On October 3rd, they boarded a fleet of 31 ships at Quebec City. These ships had been commandeered by the government from where they took all ocean carrying passenger ships on the east coast of Canada and brought them to Quebec City. Included on the ships with the 33,000 men were 7,000 horses and tons of equipment. Up to that time, mounted regiments were still a big part of armies around the world, necessitating the use of many horses. But that ended with World War I. The advent of trench warfare changed the whole way that battles were fought. The Canadians were met in the Gulf of St. Lawrence by a British naval fleet of 7 ships and sailed to England. That fleet of 38 ships was the largest armada to have ever crossed the Atlantic up to that point. On arrival in England, they went to Salisbury Plain near Stonehenge and trained, living in tents there in the winter of 1914, 1915, right through to February. When February, off they went to the mainland of Europe. Our local boys were part of the 1st Battalion, which was made up of volunteers from throughout the Western Ontario Division. All other battalions had numbers, and the lowest numbers were from Ontario in this first contingent to go. The picture you see on your screen is of the Valcartier camp, and as you can see, thousands and thousands of tents where the men were gathering prior to sailing off to England. When the men got to mainland Europe, the first battle that they were exposed to was in Ypres in Belgium, and it started on April 22nd. And here they fought the Germans, who had, for the very first time, used poisonous chlorine gas. In less than 3 weeks in Ypres, the Canadians had suffered casualties of 5,506 men, wounded, dead, or captured. And here you see men in makeshift masks to protect them from the chlorine gas. They then went on over the border with France to a nearby area called Festubert, and here they engaged the Germans. This was a diversionary offensive by the British Army to spread the Germans out by attacking in large groups in this area. But here the Canadians suffered 2,204 additional casualties, and the Germans were driven back a mere 600 yards. Then the Canadians, part of the Canadian contingent, 3 battalions of them, moved just a few kilometers south of Festubert to Givenchy. They had recently received new Lee Enfield rifles to replace their less dependable Ross rifles. The battle here was very short-lived. It only lasted 24 hours, from the morning of June 15th to the morning of June 16th. It's considered insignificant in the overall battle, but it definitely was not insignificant to the first contingent, the 3 battalions, including the 1st Battalion from Western Ontario. It was one of the deadliest days of World War I for soldiers from Bruce County. The map that you see in front of you in here is the battlefield map of June 15th. On the right-hand side, you'll see the brown trenches. These were the trenches of the 134th Saxon Regiment. On the left side, you'll see the blue trenches, which were the original trenches that were dug by the 7th Division of the British Army. The Canadians arrived here, the 3 battalions. The 1st Battalion, which is the full ball on top of the red box, which is the group from Western Ontario. Down below lower, you'll see another half moon on top of a red box. That's the 2nd Battalion from Eastern Ontario. And then down at the bottom, you'll see the 4th Battalion, which with the half green moon, which is the 4th Battalion from Central Ontario. The battlefield, no man's land you see between the 2 trench fields, was under construction for the building of a canal to meet up with the La Bassée Canal at the bottom of the battlefield map. In the middle, you'll see a protrusion marked Ducksbill. And then out from Ducksbill, you'll see a large brown crater. There's another crater up above in the upper left corner. These 2 craters were the result of underground tunneling done by Welsh miners that were part of the British 7th Division, where they did dug tunnels over to where the German trenches were, and they put bombs in those tunnels, and when they exploded, designed to kill the Germans in the trenches above them. This was a very large crater, and it actually gave protection to the 1st Battalion somewhat as they crossed no man's land. And you'll see on the upper red arrow going across, where the British did in fact get across to the trench line. They never penetrated it, but they did get across to it. The Canadian, the 1st Battalion, the Western Ontario, our boys, they crossed the trenches and they actually infiltrated right into the trenches, and they were being very, very successful. Unfortunately, below them, neither the 2nd Battalion or the 4th Battalion were able to cross no man's land at all. This was due to the area being much broader and also being totally cleared of any cover, and also poorly placed landmines that were there, and their exposure to the Germans' artillery was such that they were pushed back continuously to the original trench line. Now, here are some of the stories of those that fought in that battle. The first one we're going to talk about is Joseph Lionel Tranter. The Tranter family arrived in our community in the early 1860s from New Brunswick. Joseph Lionel, he joined the local militia in 1905, and then in 1907 he went to London, Ontario for 2 weeks and received officer training and became an officer, and was given the status of being a lieutenant in the 32nd Bruce Militia. As I said, the Tranter families have been very involved in militia, and in the 1860s, the Fenians, the American Fenians, were threatening invasion of Ontario. And in fact, they did invade down in the Niagara Peninsula. But the big threat in our area was Goderich. The threat was that they were going to invade Goderich. Goderich at the time was the largest shipping port on the upper Great Lakes. There was no port through which more goods were shipped in the upper Great Lakes than Goderich. It was a main shipping port. So the threat of the Fenians being there. So when the call went out for protection, 105 or so men from Bruce County mustered down in Goderich. And amongst them were 3 of the Tranter family. And all the men in that group received the Fenian Raid Medal, which you see on the right-hand side. And this is the medal of an earlier generation of the Tranters, which was donated to the museum here by a young cook in one of the restaurants here in Southampton. The next thing was in 1885, when they were again asked to muster because of the Riel Rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion in Manitoba. And on the bottom picture, you'll see the local 32nd Bruce Militia mustered here in Southampton, down at the mouth of the river. And the land is now used in a variety of ways. And you'll see their tents there as they waited the call to go to Manitoba. That call never came. There were sufficient forces that went, but they did, in fact, were prepared to go. And included in that group were more of the Tranter family. Joseph Lionel Tranter lost his life on June 15th. But prior to that, in August of 1914, you see him here with a platoon of young men from the area that all had enlisted to go and be part of the first contingent. And of these, there's 10 of them in the picture, 9, 2, 4, 6, 8, yes, 9 soldiers plus Lieutenant Tranter. Over behind Tranter, you'll see what is today St. Paul's Anglican Church. It was a much smaller building there, but that's the original part of the building there. And so right across from the museum is where the men were standing in the lane, by the lane that's behind the church. To the right, you'll see a large group of people gathered around the yellow brick home, which is the yellow brick home beside Home Hardware. And those folks would be there sending the men off, cheering the men on as they headed off to go to war. So Tranter, as I said, he died in the Battle of Givenchy. The following are the words written by Sergeant Milton Aiken from Ellenford after Lieutenant Tranter's death. Aiken wrote, "I miss him more than any, for he was a friend as well as a soldier, and a gentleman in every sense of the word. I was with him about 15 minutes before he leaped over the parapet, and I never saw him again. I was in charge of one company, and I was in front at the gun section. Lieutenant Young, who was in charge, was wounded, and Lieutenant Tranter was called to the front to lead the company. We wished each other the best of luck, and he went up on the trench, and I never saw him again." Here you see his burial card. As you can see down in the bottom right-hand corner, it says, buried behind the trench 500 feet east of Duxbill in Givenchy. And he was buried there. And this Duxbill was the protrusion I pointed out in the area map, and there was the shrapnel that was shrapnel into a canal that was shaped like a duck's-bill. It had been hammered by heavy artillery, and the large crater that was built by the British was in front of it. So sadly, his remains were not found for relocation and proper burial. He's remembered on the Vimy Memorial along with over 11,000 other Canadian soldiers from World War I that died in that war without having a marked grave. And beside that, you'll see a memorial sheet from the Vimy Memorial. And this is put out by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And these Commonwealth War Graves Commissions still exist today, and funded by the Commonwealth countries, who maintain all the cemeteries and war memorial sites in France and Belgium. He's also remembered on a grave marker of his brother in the Southampton Cemetery. His brother Stanley is buried here with his wife Mary, and at the top of that, they give honor to Joseph Lionel Tranter, who fell in action at Givenchy, France. The confusion on the title, on his rank, he was a captain in the local 32nd Bruce Militia, but his full-time military rank was lieutenant. The next fellow we're going to talk about is William John Knowles. And William was known in his hometown where he was born, Southampton, by the nickname Biscuit. His mother was a wonderful cook, and she made fantastic biscuits. But when they come out of the oven, if Biscuit was in the room, he would be eating them all. She'd have to chase him out the door to make sure there was some for the rest of the family. He was working at the family-owned business, which was the Park Hotel. This hotel was later renamed and became known for many years as the Breakers Hotel. And he also was recruited by Lieutenant Tranter, was part of the group that we saw in the earlier picture. And he fought at Ypres and he fought in Festubert, but his luck ran out at Givenchy, where he was seriously wounded. On June 15th, he got a major shrapnel wound to his right buttock and to his left shoulder. He was taken to General Hospital on the coast at Etretat, France, where he received treatment until July 8th. He left hospital on August 13th for convalescence, and it took until October 17th for him to be declared as medically unfit to continue. He arrived back in Canada and was discharged on December 3rd, 1915, and that time he went to work in London, Ontario at a military sock manufacturer called Hole Proof Hosiery Limited. And eventually he did return home to Southampton and took over from his father the operation of the Park Hotel. And while he was running the Park Hotel, he brought a new friend of his from London. And the new friend had an orchestra, and they played and entertained guests on the deck in front of the breakers of the Park Hotel. Yes, it was his London friend, Guy Lombardo. Biscuit's daughter, Arlene, is still alive, and she lives down on Knowles Lane, right on the waterfront in Southampton. Next, we're going to talk about Albert Henry Meyer. Bert was 19 when he enlisted, along with the group in Southampton. He was working as a watchman when he answered the call to serve. He had also survived Ypres and Festubert, but not Givenchy. At Givenchy, he died alongside Lieutenant Tranter, and he was also buried near the Duxbill crater. I draw attention to his military card that's shown here on the screen, and you'll notice the red ink, and you'll notice killed in action red ink, and down in the bottom, that he's buried in the Duxbill crater. Red ink on the military card is always a bad sign, and it usually just indicates death or serious injury. And like Tranter, in spite of his military record saying where his battlefield burial occurred, his body was not found, and he's also honored on the Vimy Memorial along with many other Canadians similarly remembered. Next, we're going to talk about William Booth Mook. Bill was only 18 when he enlisted. He was the youngest of the Southampton fellows who enlisted, and he'd been born in Wyerton, and he was employed as a factory worker in Southampton. And he survived Ypres, but on June 15th, he was shot in the lower leg, and he returned to England for treatment and to convalesce. Eventually, he left hospital, but could never attain necessary physical capacity to qualify for general service. He remained in England doing base duties until the war's end, but he did find comfort in the company of a young English school teacher named Kate Tuck. They married in December 19 after the war's end, and he returned to Wyerton early in 1919. Here you see his military request being endorsed for him to marry Kate Tuck in England. Next, we have to mention the Chesley 32nd Bruce Militia Band. The men in the picture were all members of the 32nd Bruce Militia. A lot of them were from Chesley, but there were other men from the area that were part of the band as well. But of the Chesley group, there was about 7 or 8 of them. I'm not sure exactly what the number was, that did enlist in the 1st Battalion and did go overseas. And one of them was George Hildreth Cole. In his military record, he also, while in Ypres, he also served in St. Julian. And St. Julian, for those of you who, and most of you have seen, the Great War Memorial in St. Julian in Belgium. It's the one of the brooding soldier, where the man has his two hands on the muzzle of his gun, which is resting between his legs, and his head is bowed in serious thought. Very, very famous Canadian military sculpture. In the intensity of the fight at Givenchy, he received near-fatal shrapnel wounds to his head, neck, and back. He spent the next 381 days in various hospitals and convalescent homes in France and England, having surgeries to remove as much of the shrapnel as they could. Eventually, he was assigned base duties in England until war's end and did not get home to Chesley until May 17, 1919. Also with George was Leslie Stanley Fry, and he was a butcher. He was a 27-year-old butcher in Chesley when he enlisted. And at Givenchy, he was wounded with a bone contusion on his arm. Well, a bone contusion today, we just look upon it as a bone bruise. With proper treatment, we can recover from them pretty quickly. Unfortunately, back at that time, it was a serious bone contusion, and he received poor treatment or no treatment, and he was hospitalized for convalescence. It was late September 1915 before he healed sufficiently to allow him to get back to general field service. By this time, the war became a trench standoff. And then on December 15th that year, he was shot in the right thigh, and this took him out of service and into hospital for 3 months. Then in March 1916, he was assigned work back in France, not in the front lines, but at a supply depot. And he stayed there until June, when he was sent back to England, continuous supply handling duties, and promoted to corporal. He remained in England until returning home on April 24th, 1919, and he lived until March 1971, when he died at age 84. Next one we're going to talk about is a little bit of a different story. Herbert Ramsden. And Herb was a 21-year-old American from Michigan, living in Southampton and working as a painter when war was declared. And he joined the group, and off he went, and had his training in Salisbury Plain. And like the others, he fought in the Battle at Ypres. And then again, he fought in Festubert. And here I got to tell you, I didn't tell you earlier, but the Battle of Festubert was a horrible battle. There were 16,000 British and Commonwealth casualties with very little ground gained. Now, if you look in the card down below, you'll see this is Herb's battlefield card, and it shows his next of kin being his father, H.W. Ramsden, with his address 666th Street, Detroit, Michigan. And that's his battlefield card. By mid-June, in the Battle of Givenchy, they had advanced beyond the battalion the other side. They said earlier, they had advanced and were exposed, and they endured a destructive attack on the 1st Battalion. And the group, they had 386 casualties in that day, and they were either wounded or killed just from that one battalion, about 800 men at the time. Herb suffered near-fatal wounds, including gunshot wounds to his face, his right leg, and shoulder. After 15 months of surgeries and treatments, he was released to base duties. He never did recover completely due to shrapnel embedded in his foot that could not be removed without causing worse damage. The card you see in the upper right corner is an X-ray report, and very rudimentary X-ray available at that time, but they were able to determine and identify the size exactly of the piece of metal that was embedded in his foot, and come to the conclusion that it could not be operated on without causing him much more severe damage. He remained in England and in service until April 1919, when he sailed back to Canada. He was discharged in London, Ontario, and from there he joined his family at their home in Detroit. Next, we'll talk about Alfred William Gooch. We'll call him Fred. Fred was an English-born 22-year-old working as a specialized French polisher in Chesley's furniture industry. And I had to look up what a French polisher was, and that's the hardwood, rich-looking inlaid wood tables that were very popular amongst the wealthy people at that time. And these required 15 to 20 coats of lacquer and finishes to give them the high luster that they had. And he was part of the Chesley group that came out of the Chesley of the 32nd Bruce Militia Band, and off he went to war. And it was during the battle that Alfred received his battle of Festubert, that he received a battlefield promotion to corporal, and he survived the Battle of Givenchy on June 15th. But he had come down with a horrible case of scabies and boils, and spent a lot of time in hospital for treatment the remainder of 1915. And here you can see his medical card, and all the times that he reported to hospital, and you'll see scabies, boils, time after time again. And also, I noticed about 5 lines down from the top, he also had impetigo. The man was really punished with this horrible disease, which were very prevalent, but not to this degree among soldiers in the trenches. The war had turned into a trench battle along the Western Front, and about 2 years later on June, Alfred was shot in his left leg and was hospitalized in France. He recovered, and later that year, he ended up back in Ypres and fought in the historic Battle of Passchendaele. On November 11th, 1917, he was reported missing, and it was determined that he had died on either November 6th or 7th, 1917. His body was never found or identified, and he's remembered on the Menin Gate in Ypres without a grave. And for any of you that have ever been to Belgium, and hopefully if you were there, you got to go to Ypres and saw the Menin Gate. And for those of you who may go in the future, make sure that you do get to see the Menin Gate. This is a war memorial built in Ypres, and Ypres was the most attacked city in Belgium and France in World War I. This gate, every single night of the year since 1920, the people in the town have gone to the memorial service at the gate, and along with many tourists from all over the world that have gone there. And all the names of the 6,928 Canadians that died in Belgium during the First World War, along with all, I think it was 57,000 names from the British Commonwealth that defended Belgium in the war. And it's a very moving service, and I'd strongly recommend you look for an opportunity to visit Ypres in Belgium. Arthur Robinson took a little different route. He was born in North Bruce in 1890, and he worked in Hamilton for a number of years. And while there, he became a member of their local militia. And so when he enlisted in their battalion group, which was part of the 4th Battalion. And you remember on the battlefield map, they were down at the bottom of the battlefield map. And they also participated in the Battle of Ypres, and on April 24th, third day of the battle in Ypres, he got a shotgun wound to his left arm, and he was taken to the hospital and recovered. In a mere 12 days later, he was back at the front. They also crossed the border and fought at Festubert, and the Canadian casualties there were 2,468 of the 16,000 British Commonwealth casualties that there were in the Festubert battle. And then shifted down to Givenchy. The Canadians joined the 2 British divisions, and I said before, they built underground tunnels and loaded them with explosives. Down in the area on the lower part of the battlefield map, they were very exposed. There was nothing between them and the Germans, and there was poorly placed landmines, so they were not able to cross no man's land to get into the trenches of the Germans. And he was hit in the right thigh while he was going for rations during the attack. He was hit in his right thigh and the inner part of his right buttock. And he was removed to a large hospital in Rouen, France. He had 2 operations to remove a 6-inch piece of shrapnel and had a long 5-month recovery in France and England. He returned to Canada in January 1916 and remained at at the original 91st Regiment base in Hamilton until he was discharged June 15, 1916. He was granted a $70 a month pension, and the last address in his military record was 167 Pape Avenue in Toronto. George Knight was English born. He was born in Portsmouth, England in 1875. At 39, he was one of the older volunteers, and he was working as a plate layer. I had to look up what a plate layer was. Well, a plate layer was a trackman, but he had a skill set for connecting the rails together and the steel plates that were used to fasten both ends together and attach them to the rail ties. And he was engaged to marry Miss Mary Ramsay. And he had 12 years of military service in England before he came to Canada with the Royal Garrison Artillery. And he was welcomed into the 1st Battalion when he went to Valcartier. And he was very involved at Ypres in Belgium, and on the 23rd, the second day of the battle, he was shot in the arm and was sent to a hospital in France for treatment and 6 weeks of convalescence. He returned to the battalion on June the 5th after they had moved into France in the Battle of Festubert. And that's the battle where 16,000 casualties on the Allied side, gaining only a few hundred yards. And the battle at Festubert was described and found in his record, the most brutal and intense fighting of the war. The 1st Battalion had advanced and found themselves isolated on both flanks and had to retreat under heavy fire from behind and on both sides. The 1st Battalion group, then about 800 Western Ontario men, was torn to shreds and lost 386, either killed or wounded. This was 46% of their total strength. It was here that George Knight died. He was given the battlefield burial, and his military record indicates that he was buried behind a large bombed-out crater named Duxbill Crater, and his body remains there today, along with Joseph Lionel Tranter and Albert Meyer. And here you see his little small military card showing his next of kin as being Miss Mary Ramsay in Kincardine. And here you see Duxbill Crater. This is a picture from 1919. And as I told you before, these craters were created by Welsh miners going underground and loading explosions under the German trench positions. And they're very prominent here, and there's a lot of them on Vimy Ridge as well. This tactic was used there as well. And here you see, again, the horrible red ink on George Knight's military card, showing killed in action and then also buried near Duxbill at Givenchy. And he's also remembered on the Vimy Memorial as one of the 11,000 Canadians that died in France in World War I and do not have a known and marked gravesite. And there is his memorial card. Now, here we get to Milton John Aiken, who wrote the letter home regarding Joseph Lionel Tranter. And he was 25 when he enlisted in September 1914, and he was a veteran of the local 32nd Bruce Militia. And he indicated that he was a student when he enlisted at the time, and he living in Amabel Township. Like many other Bruce County men, he was assigned to the 1st Battalion, and off to Valcartier he went. And he also fought in Ypres. And the fight on the 27th of April, he received a gunshot wound to his forehead, requiring hospitalization and convalescence for a month. And and for his bravery and actions, though, he was mentioned in dispatches in the London England Gazette. For a soldier in World War I, the honor of being mentioned in dispatches meant an enormous amount, because that was the commanding officer of a battalion. After a battle, he would identify those whose actions had been above and beyond what anyone should have expected of him. And Milton John Aiken was mentioned in dispatches in the London Gazette a few weeks later. It was always a few weeks late between. So in his case, the actions were on April 27th, and he appeared listed in the London Gazette on the 22nd of June. He returned to his unit on May 27th and was immediately promoted to sergeant. And the 1st Battalion took part in the Battle of Festubert. Shortly after that, the Battle of... In both those battles of the 1st Battalion, there was many men that were either wounded or killed. And Aiken survived both those battles. And the field officers had been reduced by 20. There were 23 field officers when they got to Ypres, and there was only 3 after the Battle of Givenchy. And this made it impossible for the remaining 400 men to go on into battle. They fell back and awaited reserves that took a long time to sort out before they were moved into the trenches and continued the war from there. For Milton Aiken, his fortunes changed very significantly on March 21st, 1916, when he was summoned to Folkestone, Kent, in England. From there, he went to a training base in West Sandling and assisted in trench warfare training programs. That May, he was offered a commission as a lieutenant and returned to Canada to be part of the new battalion being formed in Bruce County. He met the men of the 160th Bruce Battalion in London, Ontario, and he shipped out to England with them that October. And he served with them until they left for the front in early 1918. He then was promoted to captain on June 14, 1918, and returned to Canada, where he trained new recruits at the London, Ontario base. And here you see a copy of the page from the London Gazette on 22nd of June 1915, showing Private M.J. Aiken mentioned in dispatches for his actions from the prior event at Ypres on April 27th. In the bottom corner here, bottom left, you'll see his orders to report to Folkestone, Kent, which took him off the front line and put him into a training job in England, training men for trench warfare, following his experience of being in the trenches in France. On the right-hand side, you'll see his discharge, his proceedings on discharge. And he did not get discharged until August 28, 1919. And that was after all the soldiers from Western Ontario had returned home. These are the stories of the Bruce County men who were in the Battle of Givenchy on June 15, 1915. They had answered the call to serve in August 1914, immediately following war being declared. They arrived in England a few weeks later, and they were at the front in Ypres, Belgium, amongst the first Canadians to be at the front in battle early in 1915. And just a few weeks later, saw many of their old and their new friends become casualties of that deadly day in Givenchy. The very last event at Givenchy was the removal of the bodies from no man's land. You'll see here a copy of the list of men who volunteered to remove the bodies and do the battlefield burials of the men who had died on the battlefield. There's 13 men who volunteered to do that work, and there were 4 additional that had volunteered but were not needed. We shall remember them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, so much. That was a fantastic presentation, and the amount of research that you have done to uncover all of these stories is just incredible, even going down to figuring out nicknames such as Biscuit, like just incredible stories to hear. So thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Emily, for having me.
Perfect. And now I do have just a couple questions for you before we end this evening. So when you are starting your research, what resources do you tend to use as a tool? So we know you're quite familiar with the Bruce County Archives upstairs here, but what other sites do you reference or tools do you use to track down this information?
Okay. Thanks, Emily. Great question. And Bruce Remembers, the work you folks have done on Bruce Remembers is uh, becoming a better and better site all the time. But the Library and Archives in Ottawa, if you once you get names, you can find anybody in the 661,000 that enlisted in World War One. Their full military records are there, and when you find them there, the number of pages is anywhere from like 50 up to 125 pages because it's their full military record. There's some other great websites to use, and one of them is the nominal rolls, where they've all been digitized and loaded in the nominal rolls of every battalion. So the first battalion, for instance, there's a listing of all the 1,200 men that boarded that went over to England. But it's in the alphabetical order. So to try to find the ones from Bruce County is a challenge. But there also is in the information the address of their next of kin, because this was an important list. If anything happened to them, who do you get in touch with? So next of kins were really, really important in all military records. So that one's a good one to look at. And there's about 3 or 4. There's a great war project where people have loaded in information. If you get the regimental number, that's always a big help as well. But there's many, many websites that you can go to for a variety of information once you're into it. And it's and there's always growing. There's a growing list of additional websites all the time.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And all the research that you did specifically for these 2 days, June 15th and 16,
Yeah.
19, 15, what started you on that path, researching the Battle of Givenchy?
Yeah. Well, really what happened, when I found out that there was a group of men that went from Bruce County, and I read an article regarding the casualties that happened in the first groups that went over, and I thought, I wonder what happened to our groups that went over. And so what I did, I started following them from August 4th enlistment, and then I started getting a list of names from the first battalion list. And then when I got overseas, I started going into their own military records, finding out what happened to them individually. So it got me into Ypres, and then it got me from there to Festubert. And there was a few deaths and a few casualties along the way. But when I got to June 15th, I started finding a lot of casualties and the 3 deaths. And I thought, well, this is in itself is a too important a story not to tell. So I've left the earlier part of the presentation to do at a later date, and focused this year on getting good analysis of June 15th and Givenchy.
Yeah, great, very thorough detail, and we're very excited to hear the prequel to this story for sure.
Yeah.
We'll definitely stay tuned for that. And so right now it is a very important time of the year to remember our local heroes. So thank you so much for sharing these stories with us today, Bill, and for joining us virtually at the museum. So we'll say thank you all for coming, and lest we forget.